The hearth fire had dwindled into a bed of glowing crimson ash by the time Orin asked the question his mother had spent 7 long years dreading. He sat cross-legged upon the smooth stone floor of their isolated mountain shelter, a 7-year-old boy already possessing the robust, imposing frame of an ancient ram. His broad shoulders were squared, and his jaw was set with a fierce, unyielding stubbornness that he certainly had not inherited from her. Beside him on a worn wooden bench sat his twin, Soren. The boy was quieter, profoundly watchful, his deep eyes harboring a solemn weight that no young child should ever have to carry. Outside, the brutal Veyrath Mountains howled in the pitch darkness. Biting gale-force winds scraped through the dense pine canopy, sending a low, thunderous roar echoing down the slopes. Heavy, wet snow pressed hard against the thick wooden shutters, and the single oil lamp sitting between the brothers threw their long, restless shadows dancing across the cold stone walls. Seraphina was steadily stirring a pot of mountain herb stew over the embers. She did not stop her rhythm, keeping her back to them to hide the sudden tension in her frame. "Mama." Orin's young voice carried a sharp, demanding edge. It was the specific tone that signaled he would absolutely not let the matter drop tonight. "Who is our father?" She had rehearsed her answers 1,000 times in the quiet theater of her mind. "He is gone. He is merely someone I once knew. He is a man who made a choice, and that choice did not include us." Yet, when the moment finally arrived, none of those well-practiced words found her lips. What filled the small room instead was a suffocating, heavy silence, the particular kind of quiet that manifests when a woman holds an enormous, crushing secret behind her ribs while trying to maintain a calm facade. Exhaling slowly, Seraphina turned around to face her twin sons. Both boys were staring directly at her. Soren's expression was careful, highly measured. It was the way he always absorbed pain, meticulously observing and cataloging it, before deciding exactly what to do with the information. Orin's jaw was drawn even tighter, his eyes burning with the suspicion that she was actively shielding him from a difficult truth. "You look so much like him," Seraphina thought, her heart aching as she looked from one twin to the other. "Both of you. Every single morning, I see his face reflected in yours, and it makes me glad, and it breaks me all over again. I never truly know which feeling wins on any given day." "He was a powerful man," she said at last. Her voice remained remarkably steady. Over 7 years of harsh exile, she had learned exactly how to force her voice into a flat, unshakable calm. "And he made choices that I simply could never forgive." "Did he know about us?" Soren asked softly. Just then, a heavy log collapsed in the hearth, scattering bright orange sparks across the stone. "No," Seraphina replied. That was the absolute truth, or at least the only version of the truth she could allow herself to live with. The alternative, the agonizing possibility that he had known about the pregnancy and still allowed her to be cast out into the freezing wilderness, it was a thought she had decided long ago would utterly destroy her sanity if she held it too closely. What she did not tell her boys was the reality unfolding 700 miles to the south. Inside the ancient, towering stronghold of Valdrek, Kaelin, the Alpha King of all the mountain territories, had not slept through a full night in 7 agonizing years. She did not tell them that he had personally dispatched his elite trackers across 6 sweeping territories, or that 3 years ago he had stood entirely alone in a vacant corridor, holding a frayed piece of green ribbon. It was the exact ribbon Seraphina had used to braid her hair, discovered near a dangerous borderland crossing. The Alpha King had stared at it and had not spoken a single word for 2 whole days. The very man her sons questioned her about in the flickering firelight of a mountain shelter was looking for them. He had always been looking, and he was drawing closer by the day. Morning always arrived harshly in the rugged Veyrath foothills. It never came gradually, the way dawn moves across softer lands, where the light creeps in slow and golden over still waters. Here, morning arrived like the swift strike of a cold blade. Piercing air whistled through the narrow gaps in the window shutters. Thick frost encrusted the inner sill, and the wind pulled violently at the pine trees above. It was as though the mountain itself woke up grumpy, deciding anew each day whether to tolerate human presence on its unforgiving slopes. Seraphina was always awake long before the first light. She had learned during that brutal first winter that survival in this wilderness was entirely a matter of microscopic margins. If you were too slow to gather firewood, the biting cold would claim you. If you were too careless with the herb stores, the trading season would collapse. If you were too trusting of a stranger's face, everything you built would instantly unravel. She had made every single one of those desperate mistakes in the beginning, when she arrived alone, pregnant, and terrified, navigating a landscape that had absolutely no interest in her survival. But she had only made those mistakes once each. She never repeated them. Now she moved through her rigorous morning routine with the fluid efficiency of someone who had long since stopped grieving the comfortable life she used to hold. She stoked the dying fire back to life. She carefully checked the wooden drying racks, running her slender fingers along bundles of mountain sage, bitter fever root, and pale winter bloom. She applied the practiced attention of a woman who knew the vital difference between a plant being ready and almost ready, understanding fully that almost never counted when your children needed coin for food. She portioned out the hot morning meal into 2 wooden bowls, making them slightly larger than her own, and set them near the hearth fire to stay warm. Then she stepped to the open doorway, standing there for a moment just to breathe in the crisp air. The expansive foothills stretched out beneath her dwelling in jagged layers of charcoal gray and deep pine green. The forest was dense, crowding close against their clearing, and the nearest human settlement was a treacherous half-hour walk through rough terrain. By now, she could navigate the paths entirely blind. Below, thin wisps of smoke curled from a few distant chimneys, and a hunting dog barked somewhere in the valley. The ordinary, comforting sounds of people clinging to survival in a hard place. This is enough, Seraphina told herself firmly, repeating the mantra she spoke every single morning. It was a deliberate mental act, not a natural feeling. She believed that if you told yourself something enough times, eventually the truth of it would hold. Oren forcefully hit the wooden doorframe on his way out of the sleeping quarters. It wasn't accidental. He hit it because he was moving far too fast, as he always did. And because a 7-year-old boy, built like a small battering ram, had not yet learned that the world would not simply step aside for him. He let out a small grunt of irritation, shook his shoulder, and kept right on marching out into the freezing morning air, completely lacking his outer layers. He headed straight for the heavy woodpile. "Cloak," Seraphina commanded flatly, without turning around. "I am not cold," Orin shouted back. "You will be freezing in exactly 3 minutes," she replied. There was a brief pause. Orin grumbled, spun on his heel, and snatched his heavy fur cloak from the iron hook beside the door. He threw it over his broad shoulders without breaking his stride and resumed his aggressive path toward the woodpile, bursting with the restless energy of someone who had already decided that today was going to require far more physical space than yesterday. Soren appeared silently in the doorway, right behind his brother. He was fully and neatly dressed, moving with the unhurried, calculating calm that had been his distinct nature since he was old enough to walk. He paused closely beside Seraphina, his dark eyes quietly watching his twin haul heavy logs with unnecessary, angry force. "He had the dream again last night," Soren murmured softly to his mother. Seraphina didn't bother to ask which dream he meant. There was only ever one dream, the violent, chaotic one that Orin stubbornly refused to describe to her in detail, but which always left the boy restless, burning too warm, and prone to picking physical fights with completely immovable objects. She gave a single tight nod, filing the information away in her mind. By mid-morn, the small family was deep within the shadows of the tree line, navigating a narrow ridge path that wound down toward the lower meadow where the wild winter bloom grew thickest. Seraphina walked several paces ahead to scout. The twin boys hiked steadily behind her. As they moved, her ears were constantly tuning to the sharp rhythm of their footsteps, the subtle variations in their breathing, and the small, telltale sounds that revealed exactly where their young attention was drifting. "Step softer, Orin," she instructed quietly, without turning her head. "You are broadcasting your position to the entire valley." "There is nobody even out here," Orin complained, his heavy boots crunching loudly on the frozen earth. "You do not know that for certain," Seraphina countered, "and that is entirely the point." She heard him adjust his footing grudgingly behind her, but he did adjust. This was the one crucial part of their reality she could not fully explain to him yet. Not without inviting a cascade of dangerous explanations she simply wasn't ready to give. She couldn't tell him that forcing soft footsteps wasn't merely forest discipline. She couldn't explain that moving silently through a world that might actively be hunting you was a survival skill she had forged out of absolute terror. Not personal preference. She couldn't tell them that there were specific, ruthless dangers she remained half convinced might still track them down after 7 years in hiding. Instead of burdening them with the dark truth, she taught them the rigid principles of survival and let the reasons remain a mystery for later. Pick your footing carefully before you commit your weight. Read the direction of the wind before you speak aloud. If a stranger's eyes linger on your face for even a second too long, walk away calmly, and whatever you do, do not look back. Soren had absorbed every single bit of her advice without a single word of question, cataloging each survival lesson in his brilliant mind the way he cataloged everything else, silently, thoroughly, and perfectly accessible whenever it was needed. Orin absorbed the lessons too, but his nature forced him to fight against them first, which was its own stubborn way of committing things to memory. The traveling merchant arrived at the border settlement just before dusk. He was a weathered, weary man, navigating a grueling trade route that touched their specific foothills perhaps twice a season. His wooden cart was piled high with dry goods, salt blocks, and bolts of cheap, coarse wool. Making the rounds of the isolated mountain communities before the heavy winter snows permanently closed the upper rocky passes. Serafina happened to be inside the cramped trading post, carefully exchanging 3 weeks' worth of meticulously dried mountain herbs for essential supplies, when the man entered. He stamped the thick snow from his heavy leather boots and immediately began scanning the room with the automatic, predatory habit of a trader who assessed every single space for financial opportunity. The twins were waiting near the heavy wooden door. Orin was currently attempting to balance himself precariously on the narrow edge of a wooden crate, while Sorin watched him with the quiet, intense focus of someone calculating the exact mathematical moment the reckless attempt would fail. The merchant's sharp gaze passed over the boys casually, moved away, and then abruptly snapped back. He went entirely still. It was a minuscule reaction, a mere half-second freeze. The exact kind of telltale pause a person makes when something incredible registers in their mind before they can stop themselves from showing it. His eyes darted intensely between Orin and Sorin, taking in their unusual height, the broad set of their young shoulders, and the highly specific, regal architecture of their facial features. Something ancient and startled flickered deep within his weathered eyes, an expression Serafina caught instantly. The merchant muttered something almost entirely to himself, his voice a low, offhand whisper not intended for anyone else to hear. They have got the Valdrek look about them. The busy room continued to buzz around her. Someone laughed loudly across the trading post. A local child knocked a wooden cup over. The hearth fire crackled indifferently against the cold. Serafina's hand remained perfectly steady as she set her silver coin down on the wooden counter. She calmly gathered her provisions, said absolutely nothing to the merchant, and offered a polite, practiced smile to the settlement elder on her way out the door. She walked the twins back up the mountain path at a perfectly normal, unhurried pace. She cooked their supper. She waited with agonizing patience until both of her boys were deeply asleep in their beds. Then she sat completely alone beside the banked embers of the fireplace in the Commander Aldrich had faithfully served 3 different Alpha Kings over the course of his long military lifetime. He had watched the first ruler grow old, deeply bitter, and slowly eaten alive by the smallness of past victories. He had watched the second king burn incredibly bright and die tragically young, the reckless way proud men often did in battle. Now he had served Kaelin for 11 years, and what he had witnessed, particularly over the last 7 grueling years, it was something far quieter and infinitely more difficult to bear than either of those fates. He had watched a profoundly powerful man learn to carry a crushing, invisible weight that he absolutely refused to put down. Aldrich noticed the physical toll most during the early mornings. The daily tracker reports always arrived with the very first courier of dawn, delivered long before the standard administrative documents, before the pressing territorial briefs. And before anything else requiring the king's royal seal, that was not standard pack protocol. It was a strict standing command Kaelin had issued in the second month following Seraphina's unjust exile, and he had never once rescinded it. Every single morning, without any pomp or ceremony, the latest findings from the vast search network landed on the royal desk first. Aldrich had personally arranged the system himself 7 years ago, initially assuming it was merely the manifestation of temporary, acute grief. He figured it was a powerful man reeling in the immediate aftermath of a catastrophic political mistake, doing what guilty men did, searching obsessively until harsh reality finally forced him to accept the loss. Yet, 7 years later, the desperate order still stood completely unchanged. Aldrich carried the morning stack of parchment up the winding stone corridor himself today. He frequently took over the duty when he wanted to get an honest, an unvarnished look at his king without the stiff performance of the royal court surrounding them. The massive stronghold of Valdrek was dead quiet at this early hour. It was the heavy, suffocating kind of institutional quiet that belonged exclusively to ancient stone structures and freezing air. A castle that had absorbed centuries of ruthless power and had learned to keep its own dark secrets. Flickering torches burned low in their heavy iron brackets along the walls. The stone floors were bare and dark, worn completely smooth by the boots of soldiers and the passage of time. Aldrich knocked firmly once and entered the solar. Kaelin was already seated at his great oak desk. He had, as far as Aldrich could determine, been awake and working for hours. A half-eaten morning meal sat cold and pushed to a far corner. The single candle beside his papers had burned down to a mere third of its original height. The Alpha King was reading intensely. He wasn't looking at the tracker reports just yet. Instead, his eyes scanned a complex territorial survey from the southern passes, his rugged expression carrying the flat, forced concentration of a man processing logistical information on one level while thinking about something else entirely on another. He was 41 years old now. He looked every bit of his age in the specific way that battle-worn warriors do, not with soft aging, but with a hard, dense accumulation of life. The passing years had added a heavier weight to his strong jaw, carved deep, permanent lines at the corners of his piercing eyes, and instilled a particular economy of movement that only came to a man who had completely stopped wasting precious energy on royal performance. He remained a terrifyingly formidable presence, perhaps even more dangerous now than in his youth. But there was something broken, settled deep within him, that hadn't been there before, a permanent anchor of some heavier, darker thing. It was as though grief had moved into his soul, rearranged the furniture, and simply become a part of his core architecture. Aldrich set the fresh stack of tracking documents on the corner of the desk without a word of comment. Kaelin immediately slid the Southern Territorial Survey aside and reached for the search network reports first, just as he did every single dawn. The document the king kept locked securely in the lower left drawer of his desk was not exactly a secret. His absolute inner circle knew it existed, though no one ever dared to voice it aloud. It was the original order of exile. A single page of cold, highly formal language. The exact kind of bureaucratic detachment that royal institutions develop to execute their most devastating human decisions. At the very bottom of the parchment, the dark royal wax bore his distinct seal with his heavy signature pressed firmly beside it. He had signed that cursed document at the absolute height of a vicious political crisis, back when the ruling war council was entirely unified against Seraphina. And the fabricated treason accusations carried the terrifying weight of 3 separate noble bloodlines behind them. He had believed then, had desperately told himself he believed, that he merely needed to buy more time. He thought that by sending her away temporarily, he would easily find the evidence required to clear her name. That the exile was just a fleeting, reversible political maneuver he could completely undo the moment the council's pressure cleared. He had been tragically, horribly wrong about how quickly temporary things could become permanent. Lady Vessa's ultimate exposure and downfall had come 18 months later. But it had not occurred through anything Kaelin had built or uncovered, a brutal fact the Alpha King carried with a specific, grinding sense of shame. The treacherous noblewoman had simply overreached, emboldened by her easy success in destroying Seraphina. She had moved maliciously against another high-ranking woman within the council's immediate orbit, but this time she had been careless. A misplaced letter, a witnessed backroom conversation, a dark pattern that unraveled with terrifying speed once someone finally began pulling at the thread. Kaelin had sat perfectly motionless in the Grand Council chamber when the damning evidence was officially presented. He had listened to every single treacherous word with the absolute controlled stillness he had developed for moments that required him to hide the fact that his chest was tearing apart. When it was all over, when the vote to strip her rank was unanimous, when Vessa's family seat was utterly dissolved and her own lifelong exile to the desolate eastern borderlands was confirmed, the king had said absolutely nothing. He had simply watched her walk out of the great hall in chains. She had looked back at him once at the heavy doors. He had stared back with dead eyes. That was all. He had returned to his private quarters immediately afterward and stood silently at the high window for a very long time, staring out toward the northern mountains. For the first time, he understood with absolute, blinding clarity that clearing Seraphina's name changed absolutely nothing about where she was, whether she was even alive, or what the 18 grueling months since her banishment had cost her soul. Justice against Vessa was not the same thing as justice for Seraphina. He had foolishly confused the two concepts briefly, and that realization made him feel infinitely viler than the pure grief ever had. The royal search had intensified tenfold after that realization. It had never stopped, not for a single day. Aldrich was still standing quietly in the room when the courier tracker finally arrived. Wren was hands down the absolute best tracker in the entire network. He was a lean, quiet, incredibly precise man who spoke with the sparse language common among scouts who had learned that a single imprecision in their role could cost lives. He entered the Royal Solar without ever being formally summoned. An unprecedented breach of protocol, which immediately signaled that his information warranted an abrupt interruption of the king's mourning. Kaelin slowly set down the parchment report he was holding. Wren spoke with immense care. 2 young boys, clearly Omega-born based on the distinct sweetness beneath their scent signatures, have been spotted near a tiny, isolated border settlement in the Veyrath foothills, my lord. They are unmistakably mountain-raised. You can tell instantly by the fluid way they navigate the treacherous terrain. possessing the total ease and unself-consciousness of children who have grown up wild in hard country.
Their ages, based on their height and robust skeletal build, are estimated to be roughly 6 or 7 years old.
They possess an unusual, massive size for that young age, an unusual, noble bearing.
Ren paused right there, the specific way a seasoned soldier pauses when he has one final, a heavy thing to say, and is actively selecting his words with absolute precision.
"One of them," the tracker murmured, his eyes dropping slightly to avoid making direct contact with the Alpha King's intense gaze.
"The one the local settlement folks call the Loud One." Another heavy pause hung in the air.
"He possesses your exact jawline, my Alpha." The Solar became completely, agonizingly quiet. Kalen did not move a single muscle for a long, breathless moment.
Then he gently set the papers down onto the desk.
He did it slowly and with extreme precision. The specific way a man moves when he is concentrating all of his mental energy on the surface level of things to keep from drowning in the sheer depth of the emotion exploding beneath. "When do we ride?" Aldrich asked quietly into the silence. "Tomorrow," Kalen commanded, his voice raw, "before the first light." Kalen rode north the exact same way he executed everything else in his life now, without any grand royal announcement, without floating banners, and without a massive ceremonial guard. He took only 6 elite men, chosen specifically for their absolute discretion and their seasoned ability to move completely undetected through rough mountain terrain. Aldrich rode half a horse length behind his ruler, the way he had always done, close enough to instantly intervene in a fight, yet far enough away to afford the Alpha King the peaceful illusion of solitude. The small company galloped out of the Valdric stronghold long before the distant settlement fires were lit, moving through that specific pitch-black darkness that exists right between the dying embers of the night and the reluctant arrival of a cold morning dawn. Over 7 painful years of following promising leads that ultimately dissolved into absolutely nothing, Kalen had forced himself to adopt a rigid, protective rule. He would never allow himself to truly believe a lead until he was standing directly in front of the physical evidence. He had learned this lesson the hardest way possible. He knew the particular, agonizing cruelty of hope, how it built itself up into a towering castle based on incomplete information, only to violently collapse and leave a man hollow. He had felt that crushing collapse 4 separate times over the years. 4 distinct leads that had seemed completely certain, that carried the full weight of probability behind them, but turned out to be wrong in ways both small and utterly devastating. After that 4th crushing disappointment, he had completely restructured how he allowed his mind to process the search. He no longer looked for them as a desperate man looking for the family he loved. He looked as a cold commander following a trail of raw information, taking one calculated step at a time, moving no further than the verified evidence warranted. "This is just a lead," he told himself steadily, over and over, as the dense pine forests closed in around the mountain road. The crisp, clean alpine air quickly replaced the stronghold's familiar smell of cold stone with something far older, wilder, and untamed. "This is only a lead." He told himself this repeatedly, keeping his intense eyes locked firmly on the rocky path ahead. forcing his mind to absolutely not think about a 7-year-old boy possessing his exact jawline.
3 days' ride further north into the rugged Veyrath foothills, the trouble started, as it usually did with a boy like Oren.
The young twin had decided something was inherently unjust and had acted on that decision long before his thought process had fully completed. He had first heard about the issue 2 days prior.
A group of older boys from the larger Creswick settlement, 10 and 11-year-olds, thick with the arrogant confidence that comes with size,
had been working a quiet, bullying pressure on the smaller border communities during the weekly trade exchanges.
It was nothing overly dramatic or violent enough to start a war.
Just a heavy thumb on the merchant's scales, a bundle of winter goods intentionally short-counted.
It was the exact kind of slow,
draining exploitation that small communities usually just absorbed because confronting the larger town directly cost far more than the minor financial loss. Seraphina's tiny settlement had been quietly absorbing the unfair treatment for 3 months.
Oren, however, had only absorbed it for approximately as long as it took him to comprehend exactly what was happening.
Which was the duration of a single overheard conversation with the settlement elder's weary wife. The headstrong boy had marched down to the Creswick trade point entirely alone.
On a crisp morning, when Seraphina was busy on the far side of the mountain ridge checking their upper herb lines,
he had simply walked right into the trading camp without any semblance of a tactical plan, operating purely on the general principle that someone needed to say something and that he was readily available to be that person. He had started talking. Initially, he was surprisingly polite and highly specific. He laid out the exact mathematical discrepancies in the last 3 trade exchanges with the calm, unwavering directness of a child who had grown up watching his mother fiercely negotiate with merchants who consistently underestimated her. He had perfectly absorbed her formidable style, but unfortunately, none of her patience.
The older Creswick boys had found the tiny 7-year-old highly amusing at first.
Then they found his accurate accusations incredibly irritating. Finally, the largest boy of the group forcefully shoved him backward, fully expecting that a single show of physical dominance would instantly conclude the matter. It did not conclude the matter. Seraphina discovered her son 40 minutes later at the rocky edge of the tree line. He was sitting entirely alone on a flat boulder, his small hand wrapped tightly in his own torn tunic sleeve. A deep split across his second knuckle, still seeping bright red blood. His lower lip was significantly swollen on one side. Yet, his young face carried that highly specific combination of immense satisfaction and fierce defensiveness that she had long since come to recognize as his internal code for, "I won the fight, but I already know exactly what lecture you are about to give me." She sat down on the cold boulder beside him without uttering a single word. She gently unwrapped his bleeding hand, carefully examined the split skin, and retrieved the small leather medicine kit she had carried in her coat pocket every single day for the past 6 years. She began cleaning the raw knuckle with practiced, effortless efficiency. Oren merely stared blankly into the middle distance, his jaw locked tight, saying absolutely nothing. Soren materialized silently from the thick trees behind them. He settled himself onto a nearby rock and calmly opened a book balanced across his small knees. A battered volume heavily worn collection of territorial histories they had traded, 3 months' worth of valuable medical remedies to acquire.
He sat there with the detached air of someone who had been entirely present for the violent event, but considered his personal role to be strictly observational.
There were 3 of them. Oren finally offered into the quiet, his voice muffled by his swollen lip. And they were much older.
"I know," Serafina interrupted flatly.
"We were completely right about the short counting, Mother."
"I know that too," she replied.
She carefully wrapped his split knuckle with a clean strip of white linen, her movements fluid, calm, and entirely devoid of any outward anger.
Oren knew from extensive experience that her calm was infinitely more serious than her rage.
She tightly tied off the bandage and held his small, strong hand firmly in her own for a long moment before finally releasing it.
"Strength without proper judgment," she said, looking him dead in the eye, "is just damage that hasn't landed yet."
Oren looked at her, his young eyes wide. She stared right back, completely calm and direct.
"The problem wasn't that you went down there to confront them," she explained. "The problem is that you marched in entirely alone, without telling a single soul, and without a single plan past your very first sentence. You got incredibly lucky today, Oren. 3 older, stronger boys, and you got lucky. If just one of those unpredictable variables changes out here, you and I are having a vastly different conversation right now." The boy absorbed her words the exact way he always absorbed her hardest survival lessons, not easily or happily, but genuinely. She watched his mind turn the advice over, processing it, before finally filing it away deep inside. "All right," he mumbled simply. That was all it took with Oren. That was always enough. Soren quietly turned a page of his heavy book. He had not looked up from the parchment through the entire exchange. His young expression wore that settled, deeply interior look he always carried when he was processing information on a separate intellectual level from his immediate physical surroundings. When he finally spoke, his voice was directed entirely at the pages. "He sounds exactly like the man in the historical stories." The cold mountain wind moved loudly through the pine trees. Serafina's entire body went absolutely, terrifyingly still. "What stories?" she asked. Her voice came out perfectly even, and she felt a sudden surge of fierce maternal pride that she was able to keep it so stable. Soren looked up from his book then. His deep, intelligent eyes found hers with that uncanny, piercing directness he always possessed. The exact kind of look that occasionally made her feel as though she were speaking with an ancient scholar rather than a 7-year-old child. "The stories we have been quietly putting together ourselves," the boy said simply. She looked back and forth between her 2 sons. Oren was watching her intently now too, the defensive satisfaction completely drained from his face, replaced by an expression that was far more careful, watchful, and intensely curious. They began telling her, speaking back and forth in the methodical, in the synchronized way of clever children who had been quietly constructing a secret puzzle for a very long time. They brought up the small things, the tiny slips she had made over the years. A specific word she had accidentally used once, like stronghold, in a structural context she hadn't meant to share. The exact way her hands completely froze into stone whenever a passing trader's casual conversation drifted anywhere near the mention of Valdric. A specific night 2 years ago, when she had mistakenly thought both of her boys were fast asleep, and she had stood at the open window for hours in total silence, staring intensely due south. "He is from Valdrek," Soren stated. It was not a question. It was a verified conclusion. The pine trees rustled loudly above them. The ancient mountain held its freezing, heavy silence. Seraphina looked at her beautiful, fierce sons, at their steady, unblinking eyes. The incredible patience they had successfully learned from her, and the quiet, unbreakable determination she had never explicitly meant to teach them, but had somehow passed down anyway. In that agonizing moment, she understood with total clarity that the defensive walls she had spent 7 years building around her past were infinitely thinner than she had ever believed. She said absolutely nothing in return, which both of the twins instantly understood to be its own definitive answer. Commander Aldrich hated it every single time it happened. The Alpha King would consistently rise long before the rest of the military camp was even awake, before the night sentinels had rotated their guards, and before the morning fire had been rebuilt from its overnight coals. He would simply vanish into the dark. There would be no word left behind, no direction given to his men, just an empty bedroll, the biting cold that had quickly settled into the physical space where a man had been sleeping, and a heavy silence that meant Kalen had decided once again that there were things he needed to do entirely without company. Aldrich had learned across many long, grueling years of loyal service that turn of mind. The frosty air of the Veyroth foothills did nothing to ease the relentless drive consuming Alpha King Kalen. There was no halting his solitary marches. No matter how tightly Commander Aldrich tried to post the sentries or configure the perimeter of the royal encampment to deter his sovereign's sudden departures, Kalen would always discover an unmonitored path into the wild, leaving behind a cold bedroll and a brooding silence that his men knew better than to disrupt. On this particular morning, the dense veil of fog that had choked the mountain peaks for days finally broke, revealing a piercingly blue sky that cast a blinding glare over the jagged ridges. The frozen ground splintered like glass beneath Kalen's heavy leather boots as he pushed deeper into the isolated tree line, driven not by a structured tracking pattern, but by the sheer necessity to outrun the suffocating weight of his own enduring grief. The muffled roar of a half-frozen creek guided his steps toward a small, shadowed clearing where several massive pines had been uprooted by a brutal storm seasons ago. Among the tangled, ice-rimed trunks, a lone figure was locked in a fierce, silent battle. It was a young boy, barely 7 winters old, possessing a physical build that resembled an ancient, thick-skulled ram. The child was attempting to haul a massive section of a fallen pine trunk with nothing but his bare hands and raw, unyielding defiance. He had already dug multiple leverage points into the hard pack, his previous failures marked by deeply gouged snow and scattered pine needles. Now, on his latest attempt, the boy pressed his shoulder firmly against the rough bark, his boots anchoring deep into the permafrost as he strained with an absolute commitment that refused to acknowledge defeat. Kalen stopped dead at the edge of the clearing, his powerful alpha posture melting into a stunned stillness as he observed the child. The boy's jaw was locked in absolute determination, his breathing deep and entirely controlled, devoid of any childish panic. When the log remained stubbornly immobile, the boy stepped back, narrowing his dark eyes as he calmly reevaluated the timber for another approach. An unfamiliar, piercing ache flared within Kalen's chest. Before he could process it, the boy's head snapped up, his gaze locking directly onto the hidden monarch. Within 2 seconds, the child's instincts exposed his unique upbringing. He froze for a single heartbeat, the natural survivalist reaction of a wolf pup raised in perilous borderlands. Before squaring his broad shoulders and lifting his chin, he faced Kalen completely, planting his feet wide, displaying an astonishing absence of fear. There was only the calculating wariness of a young protector. In that proud, unyielding stance, Kalen recognized a royal bloodline he had thought lost to the ashes of history. "You were on the wrong side of the creek for the border settlements," the boy challenged, his voice remarkably steady and sharp with accusation. Before Kalen could find his voice to answer the child, a subtle shift in the shadows caught his heightened senses. From behind a thick pine to his left, a second boy stepped into the pale winter light. He had been lurking there the entire time, completely undetected, standing with his back pressed flat against the trunk, in flawless, silent observation. Though he shared the exact same age and unmistakable lineage as his brother, this child carried an entirely different aura. Where the first twin was a raging wildfire, this one was deep, treacherous water. His quiet eyes swept over Kalen with an analytical intensity that felt less like a child assessing a stranger and more like a seasoned scholar cataloging a potential threat before delivering a verdict. "You are not from any border settlement," the second twin stated flatly, his tone formal and entirely devoid of doubt. It was a definitive conclusion, not an inquiry. Deciding to match their lack of deception, Kalen carefully stepped out from the tree line. He kept his hands visible and his movements slow, deliberate, and entirely non-threatening as he lowered his massive frame into a crouch to meet them at eye level. The biting chill of the frozen earth seeped through his gear, but he ignored it, his gaze anchored to the first twin. "What is your name, young warrior?" Kalen inquired softly. The boy narrowed his eyes, weighing the stranger's presence against his own strict codes of survival before deciding the piece of information was harmless. "Orin," the boy barked. The name struck Kalen like a physical blow to the sternum. He went utterly rigid, his breath catching in his throat as he forced himself to truly look at the children. He cast aside his kingly reservations and looked past the simple mountain tunics. The evidence was absolute and overwhelming. It was written in the proud set of their jaws, the exact shape of their eyes, and the bone-deep royal aura that radiated from their small frames. The quieter twin watched the emotional storm surface behind the Alpha King's hardened eyes, absorbing the man's sudden, trembling stillness with uncanny maturity. Step by deliberate step, the scholarly boy moved closer to his brother's side. "You know our mother, Seraphina, don't you?" Sauron asked, the question hanging in the frigid air like a binding vow. Distance offered no comfort to Seraphina as she labored within the communal grain store of the border settlement. It was an older woman from the village, a sharp-tongued elder's wife, who broke the news while they filtered through the dry stock for signs of rot. The woman spoke casually, treating the arrival of heavily armed men as nothing more than a passing change in the winter weather. She described 6 elite warriors mounted on exceptional war horses who had established a camp in the lower Pine Corridor. One of them, she noted, possessed a commanding, lethal bearing that practically demanded absolute submission from anyone who looked upon him. Seraphina's hands never faltered as she discarded a handful of spoiled grain. Her face remained a mask of flawless, disciplined calm, though her heart thundered against her ribs. "How close are they?" Seraphina asked, keeping her tone completely even. "Half a league south," the older woman replied, shifting to the next basket. Seraphina nodded once, filing the critical data away with the cold precision of a warrior queen in hiding. She calmly excused herself from the chores and walked back toward her isolated stone shelter. The moment the trees obscured her from the village, her pace quickened into a desperate, focused stride. This was the 3rd time she had faced the shadow of discovery. The first had occurred over a year after her arrival, when a random Valdrek border patrol swept through the territory. She had packed their entire lives in less than an hour, dragging her infant twins through a freezing downpour to a hidden secondary camp miles away. The second time had been just as brutal, forcing her to rebuild their survival from nothing. To Seraphina, this was simply the heavy toll required to preserve her family's breath. She entered the modest stone dwelling and moved with practiced, lethal efficiency, gathering the medicine kits, the hidden coin reserves beneath the floorboards, their winter layers, and the forged documentation establishing her identity under an assumed commoner name. She was pulling the heavy leather straps of a travel pack tight when the wooden door swung open. Oren crossed the threshold first, his usual fiery demeanor entirely suppressed. He looked at the open packs on the table, then looked up at his mother's face in absolute silence. Soren stepped in behind him, his analytical gaze absorbing the scene instantly. In the quiet boy's eyes, Seraphina saw the profound understanding she always feared most. He knew exactly what their flight meant before a single word was uttered. Neither boy moved further into the room because a massive shadow now blocked the winter light. Kalen filled the heavy wooden doorframe, his towering, battle-hardened physique requiring him to tilt his shoulders slightly just to clear the entrance. He stopped on the threshold, one large hand gripping the iron-reinforced wood, his gaze locking onto the Omega wife he had spent 7 agonizing years hunting for. In her loneliest nights, Seraphina had rehearsed this exact confrontation 1,000 times. She had prepared herself to face his royal arrogance, his political justifications, and the managed guilt of an Alpha King who had let the War Council dictate his life. She had sworn to meet his authority with cold defiance. But the broken man standing before her shattered every defense she had built. Kalen looked visibly older, the harsh years having carved deep channels along his jaw and sharp lines around his eyes. The regal armor was gone, replaced by worn, travel-stained leather gear. He looked at her, not with the anger of a monarch or the calculated remorse of a politician, but with a raw, bleeding grief that sat entirely bare upon his face. It was the look of a soul who had found the one thing he had drowned in sorrow for, uttering her name like a sacred prayer. "Seraphina," Kalen whispered, the sound tearing through the silent cabin. The sound of her true name threatened to breach the fortified walls of her heart. She felt the dangerous pull of his alpha scent, but she forced her hands flat against the wooden table. tilting her chin up to meet his gaze with unyielding steel. "You need to leave this place immediately, my alpha," she commanded, her voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register that brooked no negotiation. The transition from the cabin to the open air was swift and silent. Serafina delivered her instructions to the twins with an unquiet authority they knew better than to question. Taking their heavy winter coats from the iron hooks, Orin and Soren departed for the village elder's home without a single complaint, their heightened survival instincts warning them of the emotional storm brewing between their parents. Once the children vanished down the snowy trail, Serafina turned her back on the fallen king. 1 hour, she stated coldly, walking past his towering frame and out into the biting wind. She led him to the eastern edge of the settlement, where the dense pine forest suddenly fell away to reveal a massive, flat shelf of gray rock jutting over the expansive lower valley. The sheer drop fell 30 feet to the jagged slopes below, offering a sweeping, uninterrupted view of the white-capped foothills stretching toward the southern horizon. Serafina stood at the very precipice, her leather cloak whipping violently in the gale, while Kalen halted several paces behind her. "I am not going to scream at you, Kalen," Serafina began, her voice carrying clearly over the howling wind without her ever having to raise it. "Shouting is for the weak, who still desperate desire their tormentors to understand the depth of the wounds they inflicted. I no longer require you to feel anything at all." With chilling precision, she forced him to listen to the brutal reality of the life his choices had carved for her. She detailed the agonizing misery of that first winter in the Veyrath Mountains, where she had been forced to rely on the transactional hospitality of hardened border crossers who only spared a scrap of shelter because the mountains were entirely indifferent to life. She described the terrifying isolation of realizing she was 4 months pregnant with royal twins while starving in an unfamiliar wilderness, desperately trying to deduce which frozen roots were safe to eat and which were lethal poison. "I made a mistake once," she continued, her gaze fixed on the distant mountain peaks. "I consumed the wrong stock. I spent 3 agonizing days paralyzed by fever and illness in a collapsing shack, fully aware that if my heart stopped beating, no one in this entire world would ever come to seek my corpse or protect the children growing inside me." Her voice remained entirely flat as she detailed the grueling birth. She spoke of the lone midwife who had traveled 2 days through a blizzard to deliver the twins, only to abandon them the following morning because her own family's survival demanded her return. "I sat alone in the dark with 2 newborn alphas who required more strength than my broken body possessed," Serafina whispered, finally turning around to face him fully. "I looked into their tiny faces, and I saw your bloodline immediately. There was no version of looking at my sons where I did not see the Alpha King who signed my exile. I loved them without condition from their very first breath, Kalen. But loving them while carrying the memory of your betrayal was a torment I would wish upon no soul. I was consumed by absolute fury every time I nursed them, and I was broken by gratitude every time they slept. I am not unveiling this canvas to receive a royal apology. I am forcing you to look at the exact cost of your political hesitation." Kalen stood completely motionless against the gale, refusing to shield himself from a single word. He did not offer a grand defense, nor did he attempt to explain the treacherous maneuvers of the War Council that had stripped him of his power. The profound anguish rewriting his features proved he understood that any attempt to center his own suffering within her tragedy would be an unpardonable sin. "I know I can never restore those 7 stolen years to you, my Luna," Kaelin answered, his deep voice thick with unshed tears. "I am not here to beg for an easy absolution. I am here because our sons deserve to know the kingdom they are meant to inherit, and because my soul refused to stop searching for you." Seraphina measured his words against the hardened reality of the man standing before her. Without granting him the comfort of an answer, she turned and walked back toward the safety of the trees, leaving him alone on the icy precipice.
The following morning found Orin tracking the Alpha King down to the barren training grounds at the edge of the royal camp.
Kaelin was alone, moving through a disciplined, fluid sequence of combat forms designed to maintain his lethal efficiency. The young boy watched from the shadows for a brief moment before stepping into the open, his chest puffed out like a miniature battering ram.
"I want to see if the great Alpha King can actually fight," Orin challenged, crossing his small arms.
Kaelin paused his movements, turning his massive frame to face the boy with absolute seriousness. He did not patronize the child with a smile or downgrade the request into a game. "Draw your training blade," Kaelin replied simply. The combat that followed was devoid of any theatricality. Kaelin engaged the 7-year-old at his actual skill level, matching the boy's aggressive energy with calculated resistance that forced Orin to work for every inch of ground. When Orin committed heavily to an offensive strike, leaving his left side completely exposed, Kaelin deflected the blow effortlessly and stepped back. "Your left flank drops the moment you commit to an attack," Kaelin instructed flatly. "A patient executioner will always wait for that opening." "I know that," Orin hissed, resetting his stance. "Then correct it," the king commanded. They clashed again, Orin focusing entirely on maintaining his guard. On their third exchange, Orin felt a sudden artificial loosening in Kaelin's defense, an intentional opening that left the king's flank exposed. Orin lunged forward on pure instinct, landing a solid strike against Kaelin's leather armor. But the hollow victory felt instantly wrong. The boy stepped back, his face darkening with intense frustration. "You let me win that exchange," Orin accused, his voice shaking with anger. "I did," Kaelin admitted without hesitation. "Why?" "I wanted to see if you would celebrate a false victory or recognize the deception," Kaelin answered calmly. "It was a poor tactical decision on my part. We will reset and perform the drill properly." They clashed once more, but this time Kaelin offered no charity. Orin was completely dismantled by the king's flawless defense, leaving the boy with a profound, unglamorous understanding of the massive chasm that existed between his current skills and the lethal capabilities of a true Alpha King. Yet, as Orin walked away from the training field, he noted that a ruler who could openly admit his own tactical mistakes without sacrificing his authority was a leader worth studying. Later that afternoon, Soren approached the royal camp with his characteristic quiet purpose. He discovered Kaelin sitting against a weathered pine trunk, carefully analyzing a map of the mountain territories. "I believe it is time we spoke regarding the political state of Valdrek," King Kaelin, Soren announced.
his small voice carrying the weight of an experienced magistrate. Kalen slowly folded the parchment, setting it aside as he gave the young scholar his undivided, respectful attention. Soren sat across from the fallen king on a flat, frost-bitten stone, settling his small hands into his lap with a composure that belied his 7 years of age. He did not offer the soft, comforting preambles that adults often use to cushion a blow. Instead, he looked directly into the weary, battle-worn eyes of Kalen and asked the single question that cut straight to the bone. Why did you wait so long, my alpha? Not what political machinations prevented you, or could you explain the sequence of events, but simply the stripped, essential truth of his delay. Kalen did not flinch, nor did he attempt to shield his royal authority behind a facade of anger. He answered the boy with absolute honesty, his voice low and raspy from years of breathing the bitter mountain air. He explained that he had believed he could dismantle the corrupt war council from within, managing the treacherous political tides without tearing the kingdom apart by acting prematurely. But that belief had been a catastrophic miscalculation. The crushing cost of that error had not been paid by the king himself, but entirely by the gentle Omega wife who had been cast into the lethal winters of the Veyrath Mountains. Soren listened to the explanation without shifting his gaze, his analytical mind processing the confession, before moving ruthlessly to the next query. When the fabricated evidence was finally exposed, and you discovered the treasonous plot against her was false, what actions did you take? This was an even harder truth for the overthrown sovereign to confess, but Kalen laid his soul bare anyway. He described the exposure of the council's lies, the violent confrontations within the stronghold of Valdrek, and the desperate, frantic 7 years he had spent scouring the eastern borderlands, hunting for any trace of his lost mate and children. Soren absorbed the bitter reality that his mother's vindication had come from the eventual exposure of the council's internal corruption, rather than a swift, decisive rescue orchestrated by the crown. So she was cleared of all false charges, Soren summarized softly, and yet she was still left to perish in the wilderness. Yes, Kalen confessed, the weight of a kingdom's guilt resting heavily on his broad shoulders. And I have been tracking every rumor, every whisper in the wind, since long before that formal exoneration. Soren remained silent for a long moment, his watchful eyes reading every microscopic twitch of remorse on Kalen's face. There was no hostility in the boy's demeanor, nor was there any warmth. He was simply an objective judge, cataloging the emotional ruins of a king. Do you truly comprehend what she sacrificed to keep us alive? Soren inquired. Not in a broad, historical sense, but the brutal, daily reality of it. I know only fragments of the agony she endured, Kalen responded, holding his son's piercing gaze. She revealed a small portion of it to me yesterday. I know there are depths of her suffering that I will never fully comprehend, because I was not there to bleed beside her. And I will not insult her resilience by pretending otherwise. A subtle shift occurred in Soren's expression. It was not entirely approval, but rather the clinical adjustment of a psychological assessment in progress. The young scholar remained quiet as the ambient sounds of the borderland camp drifted around them, the biting wind whistling through the pines, a warhorse shifting its heavy weight against the frosty earth, and the distant, low murmurs of Commander Aldrich's remaining loyal scouts.
Then Soren delivered a truth that struck Kaelin harder than any physical blade. "She still loves you, my alpha." Kaelin went entirely still, the breath freezing in his throat.
"That reality makes it far worse for her, not better," Soren continued, his voice perfectly even.
Delivering the emotional devastation with the factual precision of a royal magistrate.
"You should know that it would be significantly easier for her soul if her affection for you had died in the snow.
She would have been able to stop fighting the ghost of her past a long time ago."
The boy stood up,
Calmly brushing the morning frost from his small woolen coat, with the pragmatic air of someone concluding a mandatory administrative errand.
"I believed it was crucial for you to possess accurate, unvarnished information before the full moon arrives, my alpha."
Kaelin looked up at his son, this 7-year-old child who spoke with the profound, devastating insight of an ancient seer.
"I appreciate the truth, Soren."
"I know you do." Soren nodded once, his expression unreadable.
He turned and walked back toward the safety of the stone settlement with an unhurried, measured stride,
leaving Kaelin entirely alone with the weight of his words. It was not a comfort, nor was it ever intended to be, but it was perhaps the most honorable, the honest gift anyone had granted the desperate Alpha King in 7 long years of isolation. On the 4th morning of their uneasy truce, Kaelin sought out the woman who held his heart and his crown in her scarred hands.
He did not approach her at the steep rock shelf or anywhere that carried the traumatic weight of their previous encounters.
Instead, he intercepted her in the ordinary, windswept space between the settlement's eastern perimeter and the dense tree line, where the morning sun had just begun to soften the sharp crust of frost on the earth. They walked in the same direction, a silent accord forming between them, without either party explicitly arranging the meeting. Kaelin came to a halt, and Seraphina stopped a half-step ahead of him, her posture instantly shifting into that of a vigilant warrior.
"I desire to ask something of you, Seraphina," Kaelin began, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart.
"But before the words leave my lips, I need you to understand that a refusal is a complete and absolute answer. I swear to you on my wolf's honor that I will never press the matter again after today." Seraphina turned her amber eyes upon him, waiting in the biting cold.
"Return to the stronghold of Valdrek with me," Kaelin requested, the heavy words landing between them like lead tokens in the freezing air.
Neither of them moved to fill the sudden, vast silence that enveloped the clearing.
A lone mountain hawk shrieked high in the pine canopy, and a heavy shelf of snow broke from a nearby branch, falling to the earth with a muffled thud. "I am not asking you to return immediately," Kaelin clarified, "nor am I demanding this as a condition for my protection or my resources. It must be a sovereign choice made by your own volition, with full, transparent knowledge of what it signifies and what it does not."
"And what exactly does it signify, King Kaelin?" Seraphina asked, her voice tight and guarded.
"It means that Oren and Soren will be formally, legally recognized as the royal heirs of the Valdrek lineage before the assembled Grand Council. Recorded in the eternal ledgers of the pack," Kaelin vowed, stepping closer. "It means the atrocious injustice inflicted upon you will be addressed publicly and aggressively, not managed behind closed doors or softened with diplomatic rhetoric.
The exact individuals who sat in that great hall and cheered for your exile 7 years ago will be forced to stand and listen to the unvarnished truth, spoken plainly by the very king who failed to protect you." He paused, letting the cold wind carry the depth of his vow before continuing. "And what it does not mean is that you owe me a single breath of your life. You do not return to my side to pay a debt, nor do you return because I finally tracked you down. If you tell me today that you have forged a sacred existence here in the foothills that you are unwilling to abandon, I will ensure the boys' royal recognition occurs regardless of your presence. I will march my loyal forces out of this valley, and I will never cross your borders again." Seraphina remained perfectly motionless, her expression a mask of hardened leather and cold resolve. There are deep, cancerous political arrangements within the War Council at Valdrek that should have been shattered and burned a lifetime ago. Kalen continued, his eyes burning with the latent fury of a true alpha. "I am informing you that those structures will be utterly dissolved. This is not a romantic promise designed to sway your emotions. It is tactical information you deserve to possess." "I am not offering you my devotion as a transaction for your compliance, my Luna. I am showing you exactly what I am prepared to destroy and rebuild, so that you have the facts required to make your decision." He fell silent, having reached the absolute limit of his arguments, holding his ground with a desperate, quiet dignity. Seraphina studied him for what felt like an eternity, searching the lines of his scarred face for any hint of the weakness that had once cost her everything. "I will grant your proposition 3 days of consideration," she finally replied, her voice cutting through the chill. Without another word, she turned her back on him and walked firmly toward the village. She did not utilize those 3 days out of hesitation or fear. It was the deliberate, hyper-vigilant method she applied to every choice that impacted her family's survival. She required time to analyze the situation away from the intoxicating pull of his scent, the sorrow in his gaze, and the chaotic, roaring embers of the love she still harbored for him. A love she had spent 7 agonizing years trying to bury under the mountain snows. During this time, Kalen maintained his distance in the lower camp. He did not dispatch Commander Aldrich with letters, nor did he intentionally cross her path. He had sworn he would not apply pressure, and he kept his word, which Seraphina noted with a sharp, analytical precision. What she did not anticipate was the reaction of the borderland community itself. Vane, the weathered trader who had first noticed the royal traits in her sons, approached her outside her stone dwelling on the second evening. He leaned against the timber frame, his sharp eyes reflecting the orange glow of the hearth fire inside. "The giant king and his personal guard have been stationed at our perimeter for nearly a week now, Seraphina," Vane remarked, pulling his heavy cloak tighter, "and the people of this settlement have begun to watch him closely." "Let them watch," Seraphina replied coolly, sorting through dried winter herbs. "He will be gone soon enough." "He repaired the massive timber roof over the communal storehouse yesterday morning," Vane countered, a subtle note of respect in his gruff voice. "The western section that has been leaking since the first blizzard. Commander Aldrich mentioned the structural failure in passing to one of the woodcutters, not asking for assistance. By dawn, the Alpha King himself was up on the beams with 2 of his strongest warriors, driving iron spikes into the frost-hardened wood. He didn't utter a word about it afterward. He didn't act as though the labor was beneath his crown. Seraphina stared into the crackling flames of her hearth, her jaw tightening.
He also sat with Elder Voss for over an hour near the trading post, Vane continued, blowing steam from his earthen mug.
He didn't demand tribute or speak down to him. He asked precise questions regarding our winter trade routes and the migration patterns of the mountain game. And he listened, Seraphina. He truly listened to an old, frail commoner. I have encountered high-born alphas from the capital before. They look at borderland elders the way they look at a passing rainstorm, with polite indifference and zero memory. Your king is made of different steel. He was not always so attentive to the small details, Seraphina murmured, a sudden pang of ancient sorrow piercing her chest. Vane set his mug down on a stone ledge, his expression turning solemn. There is one more event you should know. The youngest child of the camp smith fell near the deep well yesterday morning, splitting her knee open on the jagged rocks. Before the mother could even scream or run across the courtyard, the Alpha King was already there. He gathered the crying child into his massive arms, scented her fears away with his own dominant aura, and held her until the local healer arrived. I am not dictating your path, Seraphina. I am merely reporting what my eyes have witnessed. You are the only one who truly understands the weight of these actions. Seraphina spent the entirety of the third morning entirely isolated on the highest rock shelf overlooking the vast, snow-covered valleys of the Veyrath Peaks. She leaned her back against the frozen granite and forced herself to perform an honest, cold accounting of her reality. She had learned through blood and starvation to distrust raw emotion. Feelings were reactive, volatile things, whereas survival demanded absolute deliberation. What did the evidence dictate? She knew she had forged a genuine, respectable life here in the wilderness from nothing but her own bare hands. Her tactical knowledge and an absolute feral refusal to be destroyed by the betrayal of Valdric. That life belonged to her alone. It would not vanish simply because Kaelin had breached her borders. Yet, she also recognized that her twin sons deserved to understand the full scope of their identity. They carried the ancient royal blood of the mountain alphas in their veins. She had granted them discipline, combat prowess, and an unyielding sense of honor. But she could not give them their birthright alone. She also knew what Kaelin's small actions signified. A person could perform nobility for a day, but true character manifested when the audience was gone. A repaired roof, an hour of genuine respect granted to a penniless elder, a common child comforted in the dirt. These were the actions of a ruler who had been thoroughly broken and remolded by remorse. Furthermore, she was tired. It was not the superficial exhaustion of a difficult hunting season, but the deep, bone-weary fatigue of an Omega who had spent 2,500 nights sleeping with one hand on a hunting knife, guarding her cubs against the dark. She was ready to do something more than merely survive. And with the same devastating clinical precision that Soren had inherited from her, she realized she was entirely done organizing her choices around the shape of the wound Kaelin had inflicted. Carrying that bitterness was not strength. It was simply allowing her abuser's past failure to control her current destiny. She was finished being a victim. She located Kaelin at the edge of the lower encampment, just as the winter twilight was fading into deep violet. He saw her silhouette approaching against the snow, rose instantly to his feet, and stood in absolute silence, waiting for his sentence.
"I will accompany you back to the stronghold of Valdrek," Seraphina declared, her voice ringing clearly through the freezing air. A sudden, fierce emotion flared across Kaelin's battle-worn face, but she raised a leather-gloved hand, halting any words before they could form.
"Do not misinterpret this decision, my Alpha," she warned, her gaze locking onto his with terrifying intensity.
"I am not returning for your sake. Not yet. I am marching to Valdrek for the future of my sons and for the reclamation of my own honor.
Because I am finished building my life around what you failed to do 7 years ago. That is the sole terms of our alliance.
You will understand this clearly before we take a single step out of these mountains."
"I understand, and I accept your terms," Kaelin responded, his voice thick with a profound, reverent gravity.
"Excellent," Seraphina said, turning back toward her stone cabin to begin the methodical work of dismantling the life she had built.
Preparing to face the vipers of the capital with the same iron resolve that had conquered the wilderness.
The journey back to the stronghold of Valdrek was conducted under a shroud of absolute secrecy, per Kaelin's explicit commands. Commander Aldrich had argued fiercely against an unannounced arrival, his veteran military mind insisting that entering the capital without a grand ceremonial display would be interpreted by the treasonous War Council as a sign of weakness and political vulnerability.
But Kaelin had remained unyielding. No banners, no royal processional, no gathering of the guard at the iron gates.
When they slipped through the northern gatehouse in the bleak gray of early morning, the ancient stone fortress received them with its characteristic massive indifference.
Seraphina looked up at the towering dark ramparts, her jaw set, refusing to avert her eyes from the walls that had once witnessed her humiliation.
Orin rode at her left side, his hot-headed warrior gaze cataloging every battlement, the spacing of the archers,
and the structural weaknesses of the inner courtyard. Sorin rode at her right, his quiet, watchful eyes fixed entirely on his mother,
sensing the silent battle she was waging against the ghosts of her past. By mid-morning, the high-ranking members of the War Council had assembled within the Great Hall. The chamber was an architectural relic of ancient brutality, its vaulted ceilings black with centuries of torch smoke. Its walls hung with blood-stained territorial markers, the long oak council table was scarred by generations of clashing blades. The corrupt pack leaders and territory chiefs occupied the heavy benches, while the 3 ancient wolf elders, the ultimate institutional authority of the Valdrek system, sat at the far end in carved stone thrones. Seraphina stood near the massive entrance timber doors, flanked by her 7-year-old twins. She had not adorned herself in silks. She wore her pristine, functional mountain leathers, standing with the regal, unyielding posture of a queen who refused to be diminished by the room that had cast her out. Kaelin strode to the head of the table, his dominant alpha aura radiating through the damp air. He did not invoke the traditional, formal protocols of governance, nor did he allow the council scribe to read the political agenda. He simply began to speak in a voice of terrifying plain clarity. He did not offer a curated version of history to shield his own reputation or distribute the blame across systemic failures. He told the raw, bloody truth. He informed the stunned assembly, that Seraphina had been maliciously framed by Lady Vessa and the treasonous elements of the War Council, who sought to control the throne. He confessed openly that he had chosen political compromise over immediate defensive action,
and that his hesitation had cost his Omega wife 7 years of exile and stripped his true-born sons of their royal birthright.
The responsibility for this catastrophic failure belongs solely to me, Kaelin's voice boomed against the stone walls,
shaking the dust from the rafters. I will not permit this council to hide behind the shield of political convenience any longer. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the great hall. Several corrupt counselors shifted uncomfortably, their faces turning pale as they calculated the sudden shift in power. A powerful, broad-shouldered territory chief named Gorvin, representing the volatile western passes, rose from his seat with a sneer, preparing to aggressively reframe the king's confession into a sign of mental instability. Before Gorvin could utter a single treasonous syllable, 7-year-old Orin stepped forward. The boy did not growl, nor did he draw a weapon, but he leveled a look at the massive warlord that was so purely, undeniably Kaelin in its lethal intensity that it struck the room like a physical blow. The boy's chin was level, his eyes blazing with a feral, royal dominance that refused to apologize for taking up space in the halls of his ancestors. Gorvin choked on his words, slowly sinking back onto his bench as the ancient wolf elders exchanged a profound, knowing glance. Seraphina then strode into the center of the chamber, her boots clicking sharply against the stone floor. She did not weep, nor did she perform her grief for the entertainment of the court. She spoke with the razor-sharp precision of a woman who had conquered the absolute worst of the world. "You did not lose me to the wilderness 7 years ago," she declared, her amber eyes burning through every treacherous lord in the room. "You deliberately discarded me because it was politically convenient to believe a lie. I raised the future heirs of this kingdom in blood and ice, entirely without the support of the realm that was supposed to be their shield. Look upon them now and understand exactly what your corrupt system attempted to erase." Her words landed like heavy boulders dropped into a still mountain lake, completely shattering the council's remaining arrogance. The eldest of the wolf elders, a revered matron named Sarah, rose slowly from her stone throne. Bypassing the stuttering council leaders, Sarah walked directly to Seraphina and bowed her head in a formal, historic recognition of absolute restoration, a gesture of reverence directed at an Omega that had not been witnessed in Valdrek for generations. Orin and Soren were officially, indelibly recorded as the royal heirs of the mountain territories, witnessed by the authorities of 6 Alpha Pack regions. Seraphina stood tall, receiving the declaration without a single tear. She had already paid the price of this victory, in full, in the dark, cold shelters of the peaks. What she felt now was the immense, quiet weight of justice finally being anchored into the stone of the earth. Yet true forgiveness did not descend upon the stronghold like a sudden winter blizzard. It moved with the agonizing, imperceptible crawl of changing seasons. In the weeks that followed her formal restoration, Seraphina lived within the high walls of Valdrek, letting the days accumulate as she hyper-focused on the changing dynamics of her family. She discovered that the ancient stone corridors she had once feared no longer held any power over her spirit. Walking past the eastern gate passage, where her exile decree had been read, she felt no dramatic surge of panic. The past was undeniably present, but it was merely a faded scar on a warrior's flesh, noticeable to the touch, but completely incapable of impeding her stride. She had built herself into an entity too massive for Valdrix's walls to diminish. Kaelin immediately granted Orin a permanent seat at the high-level territory strategy sessions. It was not a symbolic gesture to appease a child. The boy was provided with complete, unredacted military maps of the borderlands and was expected to defend his tactical positions. When several senior military advisors protested that 7 years of age was far too young for exposure to the brutal realities of war, Kaelin silenced them with a single look. Orin engaged with the military treatises with a ferocious, instinctive brilliance. Within the first week, the hot-headed young warrior openly disagreed with the Alpha King's deployment strategies twice. Passing the open doors of the strategy war room, Seraphina paused to witness her son standing atop a wooden stool, slamming his small fist onto the map table as he argued against a proposed garrison outpost in the northern passes. This deployment prioritizes superficial speed over long-term community trust, my Alpha. Orin barked, his voice echoing the exact directness his mother had raised him with. It completely ignores the winter migration patterns of the local hunter clans. If you place the fort here, it will be completely cut off from supply lines within 2 seasons. I have seen the terrain. Your scouts are blind. Kaelin did not growl at the boy's insolence. He leaned over the table, analyzing the specific coordinates his son had highlighted, before looking up at Commander Aldrich. The boy is correct, Kaelin admitted, a proud, lethal smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Revise the eastern approach immediately. We follow the prince's strategy. Orin nodded once, completely satisfied, expecting nothing less than to be taken seriously by the ruler of the realm. Seraphina smiled faintly, a quiet healing soothing the old aches in her chest as she walked away. Meanwhile, Sorin discovered the Grand Royal Library on his 3rd day in the stronghold and effectively vanished from the material world for a week. He surfaced only to demand plates of roasted meat, a fresh supply of tallow candles, and to ask his mother intricate questions regarding ancient territorial treaties that even she could not answer. The boy was systematically consuming the entire legislative history of the kingdom from the inside out, building a flawless cognitive architecture of the realm's laws. Watching her scholarly son disappear into the mountainous stacks of ancient parchment was the greatest solace Seraphina had ever known. She had not merely helped her children survive the lethal frost of exile. She had raised the future architects and executioners of the Valdrek Empire. On a quiet evening, 3 weeks after their dramatic return, Seraphina sought out Kaelin in the center of the training courtyard. The Alpha King was alone in the twilight, his massive hands gripping the hilt of his heavy broadsword as he went through the exhausting, repetitive forms of a warrior preparing for an inevitable war, his chest heaving under his leather armor. He stopped his blade the moment her scent reached him, turning to face his queen with an expression of raw, unyielding devotion, ready to spend the rest of his days earning the forgiveness she was finally ready to give. The ancient stone of the Valdrek stronghold held the chill of 7 brutal winters, but tonight, the air in the northern corner of the courtyard felt heavier thick with the scent of pine, ozone, and old blood. Alpha King Kalen sat with his broad shoulders pressed against the weather-stained masonry, his massive frame completely devoid of the heavy plate armor that usually defined his royal silhouette. He looked stripped bare, vulnerable in a way a monarch rarely permitted. Across his knee rested a crumpled parchment, a military tracking report from Commander Aldrich, but his eyes were fixed on the gathering shadows. The twilight fell across the courtyard in deep layers of slate gray and midnight blue, swallowing the sharp edges of the fortress. The iron wall torches remained unlit, leaving the space in a tranquil, haunting dimness as the entire stronghold shifted into a quieter, nocturnal rhythm. Seraphina approached without a sound, her dark leather armor whispering against the gravel. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. When she took her place beside him on the cold stone ledge, she maintained a deliberate distance, leaving a foot of freezing air between their bodies. Neither spoke. The heavy silence stretched between them, shifting from the tense, guarded awkwardness of two estranged souls into something deeply profound. The distant crackle of the first ignited torch flared along the eastern rampart, casting a long, flickering amber glow across Kalen's scarred face. He did not turn his head, yet his entire body resonated with her proximity, his posture locked in a state of absolute reverence. Her hands, rough from years of wielding a massive longsword in the frozen wilderness, finally came to rest in her lap. For the first time in 7 agonizing years, the coiled spring of survival inside her chest loosened, if only a fraction. "I do not forgive you for what you failed to do," Seraphina said, her voice cutting through the twilight with the absolute precision of a honed blade. Kalen went perfectly rigid, his breath catching in his throat as the words hung in the crisp mountain air. "I forgive you for the man you became while trying to undo it," she continued, her tone devoid of theatricality or bitterness. It was a calculated, honest offering, delivered with the clean certainty of a female who knew the exact value of her words and required no validation to back them up. The Alpha King did not offer an immediate response. Seraphina had expected the delay. She had long since learned that Kalen's silences were never a vacuum of thought, but rather a vast, echoing chamber where he gave monumental truths the weight they earned. When he finally broke the quiet, his voice was a low, gravelly rasp. Stripped entirely of the calculated authority he wore before the War Council, or the grand gestures required to command his armies. "That is enough," Kalen murmured, his chest heaving as he closed his eyes against the onslaught of raw emotion. "My Luna, that is more than enough." Seraphina rose without another word, knowing that the exact boundary had been drawn. She left the Alpha King alone with his salvation and walked back into the monolithic interior of the castle. As she navigated the dark, cavernous corridors where the stones had been worn smooth by generations of tyrants, a familiar cadence echoed from the anteroom ahead. She paused in the shadows of the threshold, listening. Oren's voice boomed with the restless, aggressive energy of a young warrior fiercely committed to a position. "The current tribute system is entirely broken," Oren barked, slamming his small fist onto the heavy oak table. "If the Valdrek crown continues to drain the resources of the lower foothills without providing adequate winter provisions, those settlements will freeze before the next full moon.
We need lines of direct supply, not more garrisons."
Soren's voice cut in, carrying the meticulous, maddening patience of a scholar who had already calculated 3 moves ahead.
"Your logistics are emotional, brother," Soren replied coolly, the sound of a heavy leather-bound ledger snapping shut, punctuating his point.
Historical precedent dictates that changing the trade equity without balancing the High Council's tariffs will only provoke an immediate embargo from the southern duchies. We must restructure the systemic tax laws first, then enforce the supply lines under royal decree.
Serafina leaned against the stone doorframe, her eyes softening as she watched her 7-year-old twin sons. Oren stood leaning over the map table, his stance mimicking that of an ancient battering ram,
pointing aggressively at the outer territorial borders they had once called home. Soren sat perfectly erect on a wooden bench, his analytical eyes cataloging every variable with a maturity that defied his youth. Neither boy noticed their mother standing in the shadows. They were entirely consumed by their debate, arguing fiercely about how to repair a kingdom that had once tried to completely erase their existence.
She realized then, with a quiet shock that rippled through her soul, that she had not merely kept these children alive in the frozen wastes of exile.
She had raised the future architects, the rulers, and the lawmakers who would reshape the entire Valdrek Empire. For 7 long years, her heart had been a fortress of managed survival, guarded against the biting cold and the threat of discovery.
Now, watching them, a sensation quieter than joy and far more durable than simple relief washed over her.
It was the absolute peace of a woman who had finally stopped fleeing and had simply arrived. She was home, not because the heavy stone walls of the castle offered any real warmth, but because she had transformed herself from a broken, rejected Omega into a warrior queen, bringing her bloodline back to claim what was stolen. This saga was never truly about an Alpha King successfully tracking his lost family. It was a testament to what a mother builds when the entire world is stripped away from her, and whether the foundation she creates is powerful enough to withstand the moment society begs for her return. Serafina did not endure the lethal mountain frosts because she was praying for a savior. She survived because she decreed during the darkest night of her exile that her twin sons would never be broken by the cruelty of the War Council. That resolve became her true domain long before the wolves of Valdrek ever recognized her name. Yet, the most devastating truth of their return did not lie in the clashing of swords or the reclaiming of the stolen throne. It lived in the memory of Soren, standing before his battle-hardened father days earlier, looking up with terrifyingly calm eyes to say, "She still loves you, Your Majesty." To Kalen, those words were a strike sharper than any longsword. It made the torment of his 7-year search worse, not better. Because that is the true, horrifying reality of betrayal by the one you cherish most. It does not manifest as clean hatred or cold indifference. It is the agonizing, crushing weight of a love that stubbornly refuses to die, even when given every beautiful reason to burn to ash. In the end, granting forgiveness was not a gift Serafina bestowed upon King Kalen to clear his conscience. It was the ultimate gift she gave to herself, the final severing of the chains of her past, allowing her to step into her destiny as the ultimate ruler of the mountain territories. Her vengeance was complete,
Her family was secure, and the Empire would finally bend its knee to the warrior queen.
Every wolf in the wild knew the pack was whole once more, and the frozen kingdom would never be the same.
I obey the call of the bloodline, and the true reign begins now. All hail the Alpha King and his unbroken Luna. No further words were needed as the embers of the hearth burned bright against the coming night.